Today we will be looking at one of the deadliest dive sites in the world, a place where tourists still visit, where snorkelers still float above the reef, where cafes still sit beside the water, and where divers still enter almost every day, even though the site has earned a nickname that sounds more like a warning than a destination: the Divers' Cemetery. As always, viewer discretion is advised. A few miles north of Dahab, on Egypt's Red Sea coast, there is a circular opening in the reef called the Blue Hole. From the shore, it does not look like a place where so many people have died. The water is clear, the reef is close, the entry is easy. You do not need a boat, a long expedition, or a remote support team to reach it. You can stand beside the water, look down into the blue, and watch divers disappear beneath the surface. That accessibility is part of the danger, because the Blue Hole feels close, public, and familiar. It does not look like a hidden death trap. It looks like a famous dive site, but below the surface, the reef drops into a deep vertical hole, and farther down, around 55 meters, there is the feature that made this place infamous: the Arch. The Arch is an underwater tunnel connecting the Blue Hole to the open Red Sea. To train technical divers, it is a serious dive that demands planning, gas management, experience, and discipline. But to divers who are underprepared, overconfident, or already affected by depth, it can look deceptively reachable. It sits deep enough to punish mistakes, but close enough to tempt people into thinking they can still make it. And over the years, many did not. One of the most haunting documented stories happened on November 19th, 1997. The divers were Conor O'Regan and Martin Guerra. They were Irish. Conor was 22, Martin was 23. They had come to Dahab like many young divers did, drawn by the Red Sea, the clear water, and the reputation of one of the most famous dive sites in the world. They were not remembered as reckless thrill seekers. In later accounts connected to the recovery, they were described as cautious divers, the kind of people who did not seem likely to become part of the Blue Hole's death toll. That morning, they entered the water. At first, the dive would have looked normal. The Blue Hole is strange because danger can begin inside perfect visibility. There is no mud, no darkness at the entrance, no violent surface warning. The water is so clear that depth can feel less serious than it really is. A diver can look down and see the blue continuing below, and because the view is beautiful, the distance can feel almost harmless. But as Conor and Martin descended, the dive moved into a zone where mistakes become harder to survive. They were believed to have gone deeper than intended. And at the Blue Hole, that phrase carries weight, because going too deep is not just a number on a depth gauge. It changes the entire dive. Gas disappears faster. The body absorbs more nitrogen. The mind can begin to slow down or distort reality. A diver who is still physically capable of moving may no longer be making sharp decisions. Somewhere underwater, one of them got into trouble. The exact moment was not recorded, but the position of their bodies later told its own story. When they did not return, the dive became an emergency. At first, people above the water may still hope for a delayed ascent, a surface diver farther away, or some explanation that keeps the situation from becoming final. But when divers are overdue at the Blue Hole, the search quickly turns downward. The recovery was carried out by Tarek Omar, the technical diver, whose name would become tied to the site through years of body recoveries. When he found Conor and Martin, they were not separated. They were together, holding each other. That one detail is what makes their case so painful. It suggests that one diver may have struggled first, and the other stayed with him or tried to help. On land, that instinct is noble and simple. Underwater, at depth, it can become fatal. Helping another diver means spending more time, breathing harder, fighting panic, trying to manage two problems instead of one. And if both divers are too deep, the rescue attempt itself can trap the rescuer. So, the story of Conor and Martin is not only about two divers going too deep. It is about the moment where friendship and survival may have collided underwater. One of them may have needed help, the other did not leave. And by the time Tarek Omar reached them, the Blue Hole had turned that final act into the position in which they were found. Together, in an embrace, far below the place where the dive should have ended. 3 years later, the Blue Hole produced the death that made its reputation spread far beyond Dahab. On April 28, 2000, Yuri Lipsky entered the water with a video camera. He was 22 years old. He was a Russian-Israeli diving instructor. And because he carried that camera, his final dive became one of the most disturbing records in scuba history. Before the dive, Yuri had reportedly been warned by Tarek Omar. He wanted to film the Arch, but the Arch was not a normal recreational target. It sat too deep. It required the right training and equipment. It was not something a diver should attempt casually with a single tank and confidence. But Yuri went in. The first part of the dive would not have looked like panic. He entered the blue hole with his camera, descended into clear water, and moved down through the same beautiful space that had made the site famous. But then, the descent began to go wrong. He kept dropping, deeper than planned, deeper than a recreational dive should ever go. The camera continued recording as he descended to around 115 meters. At that depth, the problem was no longer just that he was too far down. His mind was likely being attacked by severe nitrogen narcosis. This is one of the most frightening parts of deep diving because it does not always feel like terror from the inside. A diver can be confused, delayed, strangely calm, or unable to perform simple survival actions while still appearing to be conscious and moving. On the footage, Yuri reaches the bottom. The world around him is still clear enough to see. That is what makes it so unsettling. There is no visible monster, no collapsing cave, no violent current ripping him away. Just a diver alone at an impossible depth, struggling to regain control. He tries to inflate his buoyancy compensator, but he does not ascend. He appears disoriented. He removes his regulator. The camera keeps recording. And then the footage becomes exactly what no diver ever wants to imagine. A man documenting his own final minutes underwater. When Yuri did not return, the dive became a recovery. The next morning, Tarek Omar went down and found his body. The camera was still there, and the footage gave the case a level of horror most dive accidents never have. It showed the final descent. It showed the loss of control. It showed how a beautiful, open-looking dive site can turn fatal without ever looking violent. Yuri's death became the blue hole's most infamous warning, not because he was unknown to diving, but because he was experienced enough to believe he could do something the site did not forgive. Years after Yuri Lipsky's death, the blue hole had already become famous for the wrong reasons. There were divers who came only to see the place where others had died. But even after all of that, people still kept going deeper. On November 7th, 2011, a diver from Moscow named Igor Shalo entered the blue hole. He was not a beginner. His logbook reportedly showed around 400 dives. This matters because Igor's story was not the simple case of someone stepping into deep water with no experience at all. He had been diving for years. He had gone deep before. According to the report, he had already reached depths like 40 meters, 50 meters, 66 meters, 85 meters, and even 106 meters. But the dive he attempted that day was different. This time, he went down toward 150 meters. At that depth, the blue hole is no longer a normal dive site. The arch is already far above. The tourist world is far above. The cafes, the shore, the easy entry. All of it belongs to another world. Down there, the dive is controlled by pressure, gas, time, and decompression. Every movement costs something. Every mistake becomes harder to correct. As Igor descended along the outside wall of the blue hole, he crossed paths with a Swedish diver at around 90 meters. That Swedish diver later said Igor's movement looked uncertain. But Igor signaled that he was okay. He made the standard circle with his thumb and finger, the sign every diver wants to see. Everything is fine. But everything was not fine. Igor kept going. Instead of reaching his planned depth cleanly, he reportedly met the seafloor around 120 meters. That was already a major problem. But instead of ending the descent there, he continued farther down, moving just above the bottom until he reached around 150 meters. That decision cost him exactly what he needed most: strength, time, and breathing gas. Then came the ascent. At around 130 meters, Igor began having trouble breathing. This is the part where a deep dive can turn very quickly. A diver who is already far beyond normal limits cannot simply rush up. The ascent has to be controlled. Decompression stops have to be respected. The body has absorbed gases under pressure, and if the diver comes up too fast, those gases can form bubbles inside the body. But panic does not care about decompression plans. Igor began an uncontrolled ascent. He shot upward like a balloon. An eyewitness later said he was still alive at the surface and screaming for help. But by then, the damage had been done. His 401st dive was the one he did not survive. That is what makes Igor's story different from Yuri's. Yuri's death was a descent that went out of control. Igor's death was a dive where the way down was dangerous, but the way back up became the final disaster. He had experience. He had hundreds of dives. He had been deep before. But the blue hole did not care how many numbers were already in his logbook. On that day, one more number was too much. By then, the blue hole's reputation was no longer just rumor. It had names, dates, plaques. Some stories became famous, like Yuri's. Others survived only as fragments. A name on the wall, a date, a depth, a diver locals remembered. A body recovered from a place most people could never reach. There was James, associated with a memorial and a depth of 135 meters. There was Andrei, another Russian diver, whose body was reportedly never recovered, though equipment believed to be connected to him was seen far deeper. Those cases do not have enough public detail to tell minute by minute, and forcing them into full stories would be dishonest. But as part of the Blue Hole's atmosphere, they matter, because when visitors arrive, they are not only entering a dive site, they are entering a place where the warning signs are not abstract. The warnings have names. The wall above the water is a record of what happens when divers mistake access for safety. The shore is close, the cafes are close, other tourists are close. But once someone crosses the wrong depth, none of that closeness matters. At 80, 100, or 130 meters, the surface is no longer near in any useful way. It is a place the diver has to survive long enough to reach. And in 2017, the Blue Hole would take another life. This time during a dive that was planned, supported, and watched by some of the best people in the freediving world. On July 22, 2017, the tragedy at the Blue Hole was not a scuba accident. It was a freediving accident. The diver who died was Stephen Keenan, an Irish freediving instructor and safety diver based in Dahab. He was not there as a tourist trying to prove himself. He lived in that world. He knew the Blue Hole. He knew the Arch. And that day, his role was not to chase a personal record. His role was to keep another diver alive. That diver was Alessia Zecchini, one of the best free divers in the world. She was attempting to cross the arch of the Blue Hole on one breath. The plan was extremely precise. Alessia would descend inside the Blue Hole, enter the arch, swim through it underwater, exit on the open seaside, then meet Stephen near the ascent line. Stephen would be waiting as the safety diver, giving her a visual reference and guiding her into the final ascent if needed. For a free diver, the danger is brutally simple. There is no tank, no reserve gas, no option to stop and breathe. Everything depends on time, orientation, and calm. Alessia began the dive. She descended into the Blue Hole and entered the arch. The early part of the attempt went according to plan. She moved through the tunnel, using the route that many divers feared, and was expected to meet Stephen at the exit. But Stephen started late, not by minutes, by seconds. In ordinary life, a delay of 15 or 20 seconds is nothing. In a deep free dive through the arch, it is enormous. Alessia reached the exit area before Stephen was in position. And because the exit of the arch is visually confusing, she did not immediately recognize that she was already out. The light, the reef wall, and the shape of the opening did not give her the clear reference she needed. Instead of turning upward toward the ascent line, she continued swimming along the reef. She was now moving away from the planned exit point. Stephen reached depth and realized she was not where she should be. He saw her farther away and swam after her. That decision is the heart of the story. He was already deep, already on one breath. And instead of beginning his own ascent, he chased after the diver he was supposed to protect. He reached Alessia, got in front of her, and guided her upward. She was hypoxic and confused, but he managed to bring her toward the surface. They surfaced far from the expected point, away from where the main attention had been focused. Alessia survived. Stephen did not. He was found face down and unconscious at the surface. Rescue breaths were given in the water. He was towed toward the exit. Oxygen was brought. CPR was started. He was transported for medical treatment. But Stephen Keenan died. That is why his death hit the freediving world so hard. It was not the story of someone ignoring warnings and diving into the Blue Hole unprepared. It was the story of a safety diver doing the job safety divers exist for. The timing went wrong. The athlete became disoriented. Stephen went after her. He brought her back. And in the process, he used the oxygen and time he needed for himself. The Blue Hole did not take him because he did not understand it. It took him during the act of understanding exactly how dangerous it was, and choosing to save someone else anyway. The Blue Hole does not kill everyone who enters it. That is why people still come. But its history is written in the divers who crossed one line too many. Connor and Martin were found together at depth. Yuri Lipsky filmed his own final descent. Igor Shallow made it back to the surface, but not back to life. Stephen Keenan saved another diver and lost himself. And above the same clear water, tourists still stand beside the shore, looking into a place that seems beautiful from the outside, until someone goes too deep, turns too late, or reaches the point where the Blue Hole stops being a dive site and becomes a grave.